Welcome once again, and welcome to Mellemfolkeligt Samvirke. We're doing this event together with magazine Eftertryk, and it's actually thanks to them that we're all here today. The idea of inviting Liz from the UK came from Eftertryk, and Eftertryk is a new magazine, relatively new, with really sharp, in-depth journalistic analysis, and I really recommend all of you to check it out. And so just a word about where you are. MS is an organization that was actually, it's a peace organization originally, and it was born out of to counter the hatred connected with the Second World War, kind of going out into Europe and trying to build peace and bridges, to counter all that hatred that was generated by the war. And therefore it's very natural for us to engage again with anti-racism and fighting the tendencies that we see all over Europe at the time, not least in Denmark. So as an organization, we have, in our new 5-year strategy, have really formulated a focus on ethnic discrimination and anti-racism. So we're hoping to get some inspiration from Liz today in how we can sharpen our own understanding of these really pressing issues. I want to welcome Anas also, who will be interviewing Liz. Just a few words about Liz before we start. So Liz, who is she? She is, I'd call her a people's intellectual and researcher, and she's been really monitoring the far right for about 30 years. And she published a book in 2009, really interesting read as well, called A Suitable Enemy. And in 2018, this year, she followed that up by the book that you can all see here. And I recommend you guys to check it out. It's in the introduction she says that she didn't mean to scare the readers, with the content of this book, but it is actually a pretty scary book. But it's also a book about some of the resistance, because there's always that counter movement, and we hope that you'll share a few words on that as well today. So welcome to Anas, who will be doing the interview. Anas is from Mino Danmark and has some interesting knowledge about these issues as well.
Thank you, Nathan.
Let me just say that after that lovely introduction, which was very embarrassing, I was thinking of leaving straight away, but the trouble was it took me about 10 minutes to get onto the seat, so I felt that perhaps I should stay.
All right, first of all, thank you for coming, Liz, and thank you for writing this book. I think it's very important, very timely, and as Malte also mentioned, a bit depressing. Not the way you write it, but the things that you describe in it. But just to start from somewhere, one of the terms you use in the book and that you've used before also is xeno-racism. Can you elaborate on what that entails exactly?
Yeah. We at the Institute of Race Relations, where I work, we're an educational charity and we're an anti-racist organisation. We use the term xeno-racism to identify a specific form of racism, which is xeno in form, because it's anti-foreigner, but it's structural. So it's a structured racism. So it's not xenophobia, because people in power in countries like the one we're in Denmark, where they like to pretend that they're very virtuous, will say that we don't have a problem of racism in Denmark. Well, maybe we have a problem of xenophobia, fear of strangers, but that's only natural. So we use this specific term, xeno-racism, to emphasise the structural aspect of racism against foreigners, and the fact that it can also be a non-colour-coded racism, so that if you're sort of migrants and refugees from Eastern Europe, you can also experience racism. And to give you, to kind of sort of like ground it in reality, it wasn't that we sort of, sat there and thought, well, let's create a new theory because that's, what people do sometimes when it comes to studying race, you know, what's the most popular view. It came out of a practical moment in the UK when we were seeing the government of Tony Blair, a new Labour government, introducing the most vicious architecture of laws against asylum seekers, so that basically asylum seekers were being, looks like a cordon sanitaire was being placed around asylum seekers so that they weren't allowed to be part of the mainstream of society, so that they were not allowed access to the welfare state. They had their separate welfare state. They weren't allowed access to housing. And at one point the government even instituted a system of giving them vouchers to pay for their food. So they wouldn't have cash when they went to the supermarket. They would have vouchers, which was very stigmatising. And then what happened was the right-wing newspapers said, but this has nothing to do with racism. It's got nothing to do with racism because most of these migrants are from Eastern Europe, and that's why we wanted to counter with it's got everything to do with racism, it's xeno-racism.
There you go. So this has to do with some kind of institutionalization of what might be called xenophobia. So how does, and you describe this in the book as well, but can you elaborate on how does this form of state violence and this type of ethnic identity or nationalism, if you may, how do these two interplay?
How does nationalism and racism overlap?
The institutional form of the state violence that you describe as, for example, securitization of migrants and asylum seekers and so on. How does that overlap with nationalism and the extreme right that you write about in this book?
Yeah, good question, and I'm going to have to try not to get too passionate answering because I've noticed that I kind of sort of lean backwards and I might topple. That's just a way of me getting more time to answer your question because it's such a big question. And if I can start at a different place, I think, and I will get to the answer, I promise, hope so, is that I think that the way that we are schooled to understand racism in our societies is that it's a problem at the extreme. So now we're told that we're not in an anti-fascist fight, we're in a fight against extremism. That's what the state wants you to believe. They would say, well, we don't like these, far-right groups, that's far-right extremism. And then there's the problem of left-wing extremism. And then there's the problem of Islamist extremism. And all that allows the state and the government to appear as virtuous and above it. And the book is actually saying that no, that's all wrong, throw all that out. That the state and the law and the government and people of power are the people who have constructed the conditions, who have changed the laws and have created an architecture of in society that therefore actually encourages the far right. And to make that a little bit more practical, I think a practical example would be what's happening at our borders, where a huge amount of money is spent protecting our borders, and the mainstream will say we need to protect our borders from all these migrants and immigrants because we are in danger, that some of them might be terrorists or they're bringing their non-Western cultures, as I know that's how it's expressed here in Denmark. And at the same time, they put this huge amount of money into border control. So you have now what was Frontex, the EU Border Control Agency, which has become, from a small organisation, has become an interstate body. And there was a figure I saw yesterday, I can't quite remember the exact figures, but it was something like they're going from 110 staff to, 3,000 or something like that. I'd have to check it, but it's phenomenal. Their budget increases every year. The amount of money that goes into private security companies, putting up fences at the borders, bringing barbed wire to Calais, all the stuff around the fingerprinting of asylum seekers and all the technology around data and DNA and all this stuff. this is, you know, everybody's making money out of the asylum seeker. And yet they can't even save lives in the Mediterranean Sea. So if they're creating this whole system where they justify their controls with this vast expense and with a rhetoric that presents the migrant and the asylum seeker as a threat to Europe, then why should we be surprised if far-right vigilante groups are actually now starting to patrol the border areas? And this is one of the biggest areas I hope that I've made a contribution to in the book, because when we're talking about the various factions on the extreme right and the far right today, the most worrying thing that's happening is the rise of paramilitary and vigilante forces at the border who are actually going out to hunt down migrants and refugees. And the police in those areas, we might, if we're being generous, say they're blind in one eye. If we are being a little bit harsh, we may say that they are colluding with this phenomenon by not doing anything about it. So I think that is a practical example of the way far-right racism and extremism is fostered by the state and by the rhetoric of politicians. And I'll just end by saying that when you introduced me, told me about the history of this organisation, that really struck a chord in me, because one of the arguments in the book is that our borders are being militarised at the same time as our governments are leading us into more and more military interventions in the world. And it is our job to bring peace, not war, to the borders.
I think this link that you make between securitization of the borders, securitization of migration in general, and the surge of ultra-right, or whatever you want to call it, radical right, militarist, is very interesting. But there is, I think, what also is interesting is this collusion that you mentioned. So can you elaborate on what does that entail, and which different forms, because you have different forms that you talk about in the book.
Yeah, I use the concept of collusion in the book to describe what I think is happening in certain parts of Europe between the state and far-right forces. And it's not a term that I've just sort of made up. Collusion, we all know what it means, or, well, I do because it's an English word. I mean, I'm being a bit unfair to you. You all know what it means, you all speak English perfectly. It just means, you know, collusion means, in very, very simple terms, it's when you know that something is morally beyond the pale, you know it's wrong, but you don't do anything to stop it. So this lovely young woman here knows that this lovely young gentleman here is a bully, but she likes him, she's not going to do anything about it. No, please, it's not personal. I don't know why I'm doing this. So, you know, we all know, we've all done it in our lives. We've colluded, we've enabled something that we know is morally wrong. But when it comes to states, that collusion can be direct or indirect. It doesn't necessarily mean that the state knows that these far-right groups are forming and that they want them to go out and kill migrants and refugees, which unfortunately has happened and continues to happen in parts of Europe. It can mean that there's something in the institutional logic of an organisation or in their culture that lends itself to colluding with what you know is morally wrong. So I would say that if our police forces in Europe have an institutional logic of racially profiling young people in parts of Copenhagen on the basis of the colour of their skin or religious profiling, not on the basis of whether they have any intelligence that they have committed a crime, that they are therefore colluding with racism because they are institutionally racist. But the patterns of collusion that I describe in the book, which I would have to give you, I think, some graphic examples of to explain, actually really are some of the worst forms of more direct collusion with far-right paramilitaries. I draw very heavily from cases in Germany, in Hungary, in Greece with Golden Dawn. So you have, to give you a concrete example, in Hungary you had something called the Roma serial killers, who over a number of years, a group of several young neo-Nazi sympathising men went around killing Roma in their homes. In one of the worst incidents, they actually petrol bombed a shack in a poor village in Hungary where a father and son was. They came running out of the shack as it was on fire. The fascists were waiting in the, hidden and waiting, and they shot them and killed them as they were coming out. When the police came to the scene, they didn't treat it as a murder scene. They didn't do the normal tapering it off and forensic examination, which meant a lot of vital evidence was destroyed. And then it turned out much later, when these men were actually captured, that certain intelligence, one of them had been a former informer for the military police. So this neo-Nazi had been an agent of the military police. And there is certainly a huge amount of evidence to say that local police forces knew who the people were. So you can have this idea of breakfast table collusion. If you come from the same culture, if all your police officers are white and they come from the same culture as the fascists in their neighbourhood, they could know their families, So you could actually just be sitting around having breakfast with, your cousin or somebody who knows the person. The key case in Europe has been the case of the National Socialist Underground in Germany, which was a neo-Nazi terrorist cell who killed 10 people, mostly German Turks, over a period of a decade or so, all assassinated with the same shotgun. And although the German police force is a federal system, so that means there were 16 different police forces, and there was a federal police forces, 16 different intelligence services, a federal intelligence service. And as part of the whole work that anti-fascists have done to expose what happened in the case, it emerges that the German state had a very active informer system within the neo-Nazis, and they were paying the neo-Nazis to give them evidence, and those neo-Nazis were actually challenging the money back into the National Democratic Party of Germany. But key intelligence from these neo-Nazis were not passed on to the people doing the investigation, because those intelligence services put protecting their agents and the future of their agents above solving crimes. So for me, that is a form of collusion that comes out of the institutional logic of policing and our security services. If you look at the history of colonialism, there's always been targeted assassinations in countries of militant radical people in the anti-colonial struggle. And out of the colonial tradition of policing, this is something maybe I really enjoy talking with you, the audience, about, because obviously we all have different traditions. Britain, having an empire, lost an empire, still think they've got it, to be honest. That's why we're leaving Europe, because we don't need it, we've got an empire, So obviously our history of colonialism is linked to a model of counterinsurgency policing, which is linked to a model of treating people in the colonies as an insurgent force that need to be put down. And very, very similar if you look at what's happening in France at the moment in terms of the policing of the banlieue. It's coming out of that counterinsurgency model that came out of the colonial history in Algeria. In the UK, we have been strengthened in our movements around collusion because we have a strong body of evidence that the British state colluded with paramilitaries in the north of Ireland. Ireland is a country that is divided between Ireland, the Republic, and the north of Ireland, which is still a part of the United Kingdom. And many, many inquiries run by judges actually concluded that the British state colluded with the anti-republican loyalist paramilitaries who were bringing in arms from South Africa, who were assassinating, they actually assassinated two leading Catholic Republican lawyers, Rosemary Nelson and Pat Finucane. So we have that very live understanding of colonial policing still ongoing, because there were people who were killed by paramilitaries in the north of Ireland 30 years ago, and they're still waiting for an inquest to find out how their loved ones died. So these things are part of our news all the time, and it might be harder for you in Denmark to extract that history. So yes, it isn't new, I think, and it was something that I think in our struggles we probably overlooked, but in a sense we didn't overlook, because in the UK over the last 30 years there's been very, very strong and very effective struggles around institutional racism in policing. And I think institutional racism is a form of collusion, but we were more concerned, it was more important for us to label that institutional racism.
Yeah, because a lot of people today would, some people would describe and compare this era to the pre-Hitler 30s, and in some way you can make parallels, but how do you view this comparison that people sometimes make? What is different today, and what is...
Personally, I don't think that this is a return to the 1930s, in the sense that we're in a different historical epoch, so I think we have to be specific. It's important to alert people and wake people up to what's happening, but actually it's not the same, because in the 1930s you had competing nation states. Nowadays you have a globalized economy, and you have different power blocks, international power blocks, who are trying to sort of gain sort of hegemony, to use a Gramscian term. But what I see is happening is that since the financial crash of 2008 and 2009, this model that we've all been told is the only way, this neoliberal model, this model of deregularisation and privatisation is the only way. Everybody knows it's not going to work anymore. So nationalism that we're seeing is in a sense it's like the boomerang effect to that. But it can't work. It can't work in today's world where there are global circuits of capital, where half of the real estate in London is owned not by Londoners, is owned by foreign companies, owned by China, it's owned by Russia, it's not going to work. So I see this moment as a crisis in neoliberalism, and they're working it out. They're working it out. And this is why it's so important, each and every one of us in this room is fighting for whatever you believe in. You don't have to believe in the same things as me, as long as it's a progressive cause that you're fighting, whether it's green or it's socialist or it's feminist or whatever. We all have to stand and fight for it, because we are at a critical moment where basically I think that this neoliberal class are reforming, and they see that possibly that nationalism is the route to keep it all ticking over.
How do you see specifics about Scandinavia in this context? That's not, as I would describe, not quite as extreme as Hungary or Italy, but there's still some, I feel, deep-rooted aspects of what you described that actually have started even earlier maybe than in other countries. Do you have any reflections on this?
Yeah, I can't say that I have spent much time in Denmark over the years. More time definitely in Sweden. I've been over that bridge quite a few times. And Norway. So Sweden and Norway are probably countries that I know much better than Denmark, and I don't know whether it's the same, but what I can say about the Scandinavian model, because every country is different, and the way that they conceptualise race, or race relations, or relations with minorities, draws from their history, their narrative about themselves, and their national history. So what I've always experienced in Sweden and Norway is this deeply entrenched view that we are very egalitarian societies. The Scandinavian model is very egalitarian, lends itself, and there's a very good academic, unfortunately she died really rather young, her name was Marion Gullestad, and she wrote a brilliant book on this. And basically what Marion Gullestad was saying, that this notion of egalitarianism is built around the idea of likeness, similarity. So actually, you can be egalitarian if you're all the same. It's not hard, is it? You know, I love my daughter. Doesn't necessarily mean I love her friends. You know, if we're all just, in one happy little family, we're all the same, you can be egalitarian. But actually, difference within this model, difference just poses a problem. So I don't know if that's the same here, but it's certainly what I've found in the Scandinavian context, and which is also why the whole, the feminist stuff in much of the Scandinavian context against girls and women who wear the hijab has been very extreme, because they don't see the girl or the woman who wears the hijab as an individual with autonomy and making their own decisions. They project a view of that young woman as a non-autonomous being, because they have strong perceptions about what is an acceptable form of feminism, which is essentially a feminism which is like them, very white, middle class, if you like. Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
A little bit.
Yeah.
Well, what's the question?
It was about what was specific, was it?
Yeah.
I'm just joking.
Yeah. No, I think, it was just to open up for a relevant discussion afterwards. I think that I would like to say thank you first of all, and I think that we're taking a break now. Is that right?
Yes.
Right.
So we'll take a break for 10 minutes. So please be back here at 5 o'clock. Then we'll have some table discussions, and then all your questions for Liz, you can bring that forward. So please be back in 10 minutes.
In terms of, the fact that I didn't do enough about the sort of comparative stuff between countries, didn't talk about, the long history of colonialism, totally accept that. It's just one of these things, when you write a book, you make choices about what you will concentrate on, and I'm not a historian. But having said that, hopefully in the book there is more that gives a historical thing, and there's more examples from different countries, and it's clear in terms of Britain, and what is different about Britain is also what has been different about the resistance to racism in Britain, because when the immigrants, if you like, after the Second World War and in the 1950s came because they had a colonial relationship with the mother country. And as colonials, they have the rights of citizenship as Commonwealth citizens, which put them in a stronger position than, say, the Gastarbeiter in Germany, who didn't have citizenship rights, to fight for their social rights and their civil rights. which is why in the UK we were the first country in Europe, or the only country in Europe, where our government briefly recognised that there was institutional racism in the police. This followed an inquiry into the murder of an African Caribbean boy called Stephen Lawrence, which was botched up by the police. So yes, that colonial history also created the boomerang effect of a strong anti-colonial tradition and a strong fight against racism. I think I'll start with the point about the critical point. I think there are always periods in history where you're kind of on the cusp. It's like a moment where you're waiting to go from one society to the next, and whether it was from a feudal society to an industrial society, the industrial society to a post-industrial society, I feel that we're on the cusp of entering into maybe a new period of our history in European history. So, but cusp moments are also moments where a battle can be fought for values, to restate our values, which is why I think what's happening tomorrow in the demonstration is so important, because it's a cusp moment, and when the system gets so obviously brutal or so obviously racist or so obviously about dispossessing poor people, it opens people's eyes, and there's a moment where, you know, everything can be won. So that's the kind of thing that I was thinking. Why I think it's dangerous if we don't win, or if we don't go out there and fight to reassert our values, because maybe, you know, winning and losing are very definite things. Maybe we're always winning and we're always losing. You win a bit here, you lose a bit there. But where I think the danger is that with the extreme right and the hard right and the far right, we're moving to a new era of what I call convergence. It's not that the far right pushes the centre to the extreme and they're sort of hopelessly trying to be nice people, but, you know, they just want to stay in power, so they end up being a racist, but they're nice. Really, that's not really what's happening. But there's a convergence of interests. There was a convergence of interests about limiting the right to asylum. There was a convergence of interests around shrinking the welfare state. And now we're entering a period where there's a convergence of interests about how to disappear people who are a social problem, or considered a social problem. So the danger is that the law and order views of the far right, which is a return to the death penalty to increase the population, will converge with the interests of the centre that don't know what to do with the social problem. So that's kind of hopefully answering the first part of your question. So in the UK at the moment, there's a lot of talk now. Everybody says that racism is about unconscious bias. And so at the institutional level, nobody talks about structural racism anymore, even though we fought and we won that there is structural racism. So they say, well, we've done that, it's a post-racial society, we've done all that, but we've still got a problem of unconscious bias. Now that is a massive step back in our country. It's a massive step back from a point when we said it's the institutional logic, it's the culture of the organisation, it's not about just having a few minority faces in high positions, and it's not about individual prejudices. So for us, we fought against the tendency to reduce racism to attitudes, to prejudice, to xenophobia and unconscious bias. Now all I can say is, I don't know, in Denmark, if you've got to the point where nobody's going to even admit that they're unconsciously biased because they think they're so perfect and virtuous, and as the woman said before, you know, Denmark with its history of colonialism, but, you know, obviously, I don't know enough, but presumably they thought that they were good colonialists, and, you know, that they were very egalitarian in the way that they went around, you know, like carving up, you know, the colonies. But if you've got a system where everyone thinks they're so virtuous, don't call me a racist, because, you know, we are the most anti-racist people, and there's a lot of that in Denmark, I think, from what I've seen in the past around, you know, funnily enough, in the organisation sitting here in this office, in the human rights and humanitarian things. Oh, we give so much. We're so generous to all those countries. We're such a generous people. So maybe, you know, here, for them to admit, oh, we have got an unconscious bias, and maybe we're not quite as generous as we thought. Maybe that's an advance. I don't know. You have to work those things out. I don't think that I would say it's inevitable, because inevitable depends on us. But if we continue to allow those people in power who are responding to clearly is, you know, we always used to laugh, sorry to digress, I will get back. We always used to laugh at the left sometimes in my country, like, you know, everybody would say, you go to a meeting and then, comrades, there's a crisis in capitalism. Oh, for God's sake, you've been saying that for 30 years, that there's a crisis in capitalism. You know, what's happening? Why doesn't it happen? So on one level, you'd laugh at that, but actually now we are facing this. I'm not saying there's a crisis in capitalism. I'm saying that there's a crisis in this particular version of capitalism at the moment. Capitalism is very good at remaking itself. You know, one way that they're saying, if you read all the textbooks now, they'll say that they'll come out of this crisis with going green, and we'll have green capitalism. Because, you know, all the inventions and the research around green technology will allow the capitalists to replenish themselves. So I would say that what has happened in terms of the economic crisis, that it's become very useful for people to divide society between them and us, citizen and foreigner, native and non-native, resident of the ghetto and decent citizen in some glorious suburb of Copenhagen. Don't know. So it's not inevitable that them and us situation will continue, but it will be inevitable if we don't do something more to stop it. And I don't know if that answers your question, but I tried. I think is really, really important. But we have to have unity in difference, in the sense that, you know, one of the troubles with the people who always talk about like a universal fight, you know, you have that a lot in the kind of secular feminist movement, in the movements that are against Muslim womanhood and whose sisterhood is only for certain women, is that the danger is that if we say we want a universal fight, of course we want a universal fight, but there isn't this space out there called universal space. And unfortunately, all the people who talk about that universal space, they tend to be sort of white middle class people. So yeah, I think we all believe in universal values, but to create a genuinely universal space, we have to build unity in difference, which means that we have to take all the fights of all the people and somehow bring them all together, but without also recognising that there are contradictions, and it's going to be hard and it's going to be bloody and we're going to fall out on the way. Because, you know, there are also, you know, white working class people out there who have been dispossessed and who are going to the far right. How do we get to them, you know? So it isn't easy, but we have to hold on to the different parts of the struggle and try and find some sort of vehicle. And that's our problem. That's the problem we face. It's a really deep problem. That, you know, when I first came, I'm not the oldest person in the room, perchance, maybe, people older than me. But when I first came into politics, it was the idea of a vanguard party. And, you know, there's this Marxist-Leninist tradition, and there will be a party that will be the vanguard, and it will take us all to the promised land. But, you know, we've seen that that's failed. But we're not quite sure what our model is. Because then we have this period of, like, you know, it was all vertical, and it was all social movements, and, you know, and it was all going to be fine, but it wasn't. So we're we're in that cusp period where we haven't found quite the right vehicle that can take us to the promised land. But we'll get there. We'll find it as long as we respect the differences in our struggle. So I mean, I hope that was helpful. Biometrics, technology. Oh God, I can't even turn the computer on in the morning. Jess, who's here from London with me, will tell you how useless I am with technology. But for certain, it was a serious question, and it's a very serious point in terms of the mechanisms of social control that they are building. And we're doing some. I mean, Jessica and myself, we come from London. We fortuitously, I was invited to come and speak about my book before we knew that there was going to be a demonstration tomorrow. But it's worked out so brilliantly because we're struggling against some of the same things in London that are happening here in Copenhagen, and that's what Jess she's doing. She lives in an area of London that is similar to the areas that you're working in. Sorry, Jess, I'm speaking for you. And what we're finding is that actually what is terrifying in the terms of the social control of particular neighbourhoods is the whole way that they use, they call it predictive determinative analysis or something, but algorithms. Basically algorithms and computerised systems where, for instance, young black people are put on what's called the gangs matrix in London, which means that if you are suspected of being a gang member, you're not even to be suspected of being a gang member. If you know a friend of yours is a gang member, you will end up on this gang matrix list, which then is shared by the police with probation, with the housing department, with the local authority. And the housing department can say, you're a member of gang, that means your family's got a council house, and unless you become an informer for us and give us information on the gang, your family are going to lose your council house. So this is all the things where technology comes in, and biometrics, facial recognition. Oh, I'm not doing badly for someone who can't turn on the computer. It all comes in this way, and what's terrifying about it is the way that people in different parts of government, who again will see themselves as virtuous anti-racist people, have fallen into systems of racial and religious profiling, because the technology allows them to think that they think they're safeguarding. That's a really important thing that's come out of the UK struggle. All the stuff around preventing violent extremism amongst young Muslims, it all comes out of this idea that you're safeguarding people. And safeguarding is the route from which they are bringing in all this biometrics and all these different forms of control. Is the answer to far-right populism, left-wing populism? No, I don't think so. I honestly don't think so. And that's partly why I said the Five-Star Movement, because Five-Star Movement, I mean, personally, I'm not even sure if they could ever be categorised as left-wing populists, but they were categorised as left-wing populists. And they're now in a coalition government with the League in Italy, which is probably one of the most racist parties, came to power promising to deport 60,000 migrants. There's been such an upsurge in racist murders and racial violence, and the Five-Star so-called left-wing populists are in alliance with the racists. I think there has to be movements that draw on deeper roots than populism. I think of populism as, you could just sort of get your pair of scissors and snip off that flower from its roots. And I think the movements that we need to build are actually built on a tradition that has deep roots in our cultures, whatever our cultures are, whatever our political cultures or our personal cultures are. And I mean, it's one of the things that I see where we have hope Because although the extreme right and the far right might seem on the ascendancy, they have no answers. They have no answers apart from whipping up racism and hate. They have no answers to the crisis in the economic model. They just shout, and they're angry, and they're vile, and they're loud. But the things that we have from our movement are kind and are gentle, but are also vigorous and vital, and that isn't a populism. It's something that has much deeper values.